There is a particular kind of silence that sits on a ship at sea on a clear night, the slow, patient hush of water against steel, the low machinery thrum that becomes a heartbeat for those who sleep above it. In the spring of 1912, a new kind of silence folded over the North Atlantic, the silence of confidence. A ship of unusual scale and ambition slid from the slips in Belfast and into a world that was being reshaped by industry, speed, and empire. She was enormous, a city of glass and wood and brass made to cross the ocean in luxury. Nearly 270 meters from bow to stern, heavy as an idea, threaded with electric lights, heated promenades, a grand staircase carved into the imagination of the age. She carried passengers and crew numbering in the low thousands, each with their own reasons for boarding: commerce, adventure, a new life, a return home. The ship's name entered the air like a promise. Designers had built her with a new logic, a system of watertight compartments and electrically operated doors that could isolate damage and keep the hull intact. In the newspapers and in the public mind, she became a symbol of modern engineering. And with that symbol came a fragile undercurrent of certainty. There was also the human texture beneath the machinery, the seamstresses and stokers, the passengers in third-class steerage whose voices were often out of sight, and the elite in first class, who drank their coffee under chandeliers as the sea made no distinction between them. When she slipped from Southampton, bound for New York on April 10, 1912, the Atlantic was a stage. The voyage was an experiment in speed and style, a test of industrial skill, and an ordinary crossing for the many lives aboard. On the evening of April 14th, the sea was black and clear, the sky spangled with stars. There were reports of ice in the shipping lanes, telegrams and precautions, but the ship continued at near cruising speed. Then, a sound like a metal breath, an impact along the starboard flank. The iceberg did not explode the hull in a single cinematic rupture. It scraped tear by tear along the plates and rivets, opening seams in several of the forward compartments. The ship's designers had planned for some compartments to flood. They had not planned for enough of them to be breached. What followed was a choreography of decisions and misread signals: the order to lower boats, the dispatch of wireless calls for help, the doctrinal mores of the era that shaped who boarded first. Lifeboats were launched into a cold night, many carrying empty benches where more people might have fit. Class divisions, language barriers, and confusion at muster stations left whole groups unable to reach the decks where rescue was unfolding. The wireless operators were at their instruments, sending distress through a network that was simultaneously new and imperfect. A rescue came, but not quickly enough. Carpathia, steaming from New York, altered course when it received the message and raced toward the coordinates. Nearby vessels and the human will to help converged across the black water, but the ship itself, immense and stubborn, was working through the physics of flooding. The bow sank slowly, stern rising like a beast's tail, then the final, catastrophic descent. It took roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes from the first water's claim until the lights submerged and the hull slipped beneath an indifferent ocean. Of the approximately 2,224 people on board, about 700 were pulled into lifeboats and later rescued by the Carpathia. Roughly 1,500 souls were lost to the cold and the dark. Men, women, and children, musicians who continued to play as if defying the inevitability of water, stokers whose hands were black with coal and who worked until the end. Their absence reshaped families, villages, and the consciousness of nations. The image of people on open boats in the starlit cold is difficult to detach from the physical facts. Water that night hovered around freezing. In such temperatures, exposed skin ceases to be merely uncomfortable and becomes a danger that reaches down into organs. Hypothermia does not wait. The sea preserved no mercy. Survivors spoke of silence that followed the hull's breaking, a a silence filled with the small, precise sounds of oars and the wet slap of canvas and the distant calls of men trying to be counted. When dawn came, the sea returned to ordinary motions, as if indifferent to the enormity of human loss it had ingested. In the weeks that followed, two nations convened inquiries. The records were painstaking. Testimony about the ship's speed, the lookouts, the ice warnings, the lifeboat drill that had not been. The courts made sense of engineering and policy, but they could not replace those who had been lost. The hearings led to changes that were immediate and structural. Lifeboat regulations were rewritten so that ships would carry enough boats for everyone aboard. Wireless stations were required to maintain round-the-clock watches. Routes and reporting systems for ice were improved, and an international ice patrol was established. The legacy was not only grief, but also a series of reforms that would reshape sea travel and, in some measure, save future lives. For decades, the story existed in photographs, ticket stubs, and in the testimonies of survivors and survivors' children. Then, in 1985, the hull was found, not intact, but scattered. Two main pieces separated by a carpet of flotsam and a field of personal artifacts, torn furniture, and the rusting skeletons of a human-made wonder. At nearly 3,800 meters below the surface, the wreck lay in cold silence, where the pressure is enormous and the light is stolen. Under the gaze of cameras and remotely operated vehicles, the stern remained collapsed and broken, a cathedral turned inside out, while the bow stood as a darker monument, its prow marked by the slow growth of rusticles, those icicle-like formations formed by bacteria feasting on the iron and gradually reclaiming the structure. The sea, which had once taken so violently, had now become its own conservator and consumer. The wreck reminded the world that time and nature have their ways of moving things toward new states. Steel yields to chemistry, stories yield to memory, grief yields to legislation and to the rituals we create to remember. There is a science to the wreck, as well as a poetry. The way iron oxidizes at abyssal temperatures, the slow collapse of decks, the pattern of deterioration across the two separated sections, all of it tells a story about corrosion, about the sea's habit of incorporating the human into its own ecology. Conservationists and maritime archaeologists argued about exploration, about whether cameras should pry for the sake of knowledge or leave the site as a grave. The debate reflected a deeper question. How does a society honor loss while seeking to learn? How do we balance the appetite for discovery with respect for the dead? Culturally, the ship's story became a parable for an era, the hubris of certainty confronted by the reality of risk. The vessel embodied modernity's contradictions, enormous technical achievement paired with social inequalities, a promise of safety paired with an insufficient capacity to protect everyone aboard. The narratives that followed were not only about metal and water, but about the human calculus of trust. Who commands, who obeys, who is seen, and who is not. The numbers of survivors broken down by class and region became a mirror for societies that had allowed rigid distinctions to govern life chances in a crisis. The funerals and monuments erected in ports and towns across continents were less about closure than about refusing to forget. There are quieter legacies too. The people who worked in the shipyards and those who lost kin found ways to carry forward. Safety rails were redrawn. Wireless became a lifeline rather than a novelty. The tragedy reshaped ship design in ways both obvious and subtle, and it changed how we think about risk and technology. The lesson that redundancy matters, that failure modes must be imagined before catastrophe forces them into being. What settles most firmly as the years become a kind of sediment is the human texture of the event. Names on plaques, a photograph of a child, a letter never sent. These are the traces that make abstraction into flesh. Memory operates in the small places. A town that lost sons who never returned. A family that changed course because one berth remained empty. a band that chose melody over panic. Those intimate losses ripple outward and in time become part of a shared heritage. We tell the story not to emphasize the spectacle of disaster, but to keep alive the faces of those who were there and to interrogate the choices that led to the outcome. Standing back, the ship is a parable of limits. It demonstrates how human systems, however brilliant, are bound by circumstance and oversight. It shows the ways technology can extend us and yet still leave us vulnerable to the elemental. But it also reveals the capacity for courage, for small acts of care in the coldest of nights. Rescue efforts, often improvised and performed under duress, remind us that even in the wake of error, there is room for compassion. The world that emerged after April 1912 was one in which the language of safety acquired urgency. Maritime law and international cooperation took cues from tragedy and moved to prevent its repetition. Time, which witnessed the construction and the descent, now asks a simpler question. What do we keep of such an event? We preserve the engineering lessons, codify the procedures, and erect monuments. We teach the names and the facts to new generations. But perhaps the most difficult inheritance is ethical, the demand that we consider how our designs and our social structures place people at risk. To remember is to hold these contradictions in our minds at once. The ingenuity that created the ship, the ordinary life that powered its voyage, the systemic oversights that made disaster possible, and the human compassion that followed. There is a finalness to the ocean's claim that no architecture can annul, but there is also a continuity in the way we learn. The ship rests now in a dark place, her bones slowly becoming part of the seabed. Above, her story keeps being retold, in classrooms, in maritime law, in memorials, and in private recollection. The narrative of that night endures because it binds engineering and ethics, because it is a lesson written in steel and salt water about what it means to build, to travel, and to bear responsibility for one another. When we think of that ship, we imagine not only the cold and the drowning metal, but the cluster of simple acts that followed. A lifeboat lowered by a trembling crewman, a musician who kept time with his bow as if to calm the impossibility beneath him, a wireless operator who tapped a repetitive distress into the night. These small gestures are the ones that linger. They are the human light in a story that might otherwise dissolve into statistics. They remind us that even amid great design and great error, the measure of our action is in how we protect the vulnerable and how we answer the next call for change. In the end, the Atlantic holds both the wreck and the lesson, and we keep returning to learn, to mourn, and to remember, because memory is the vessel that keeps the living answerable to the dead.